And now, the Everfree Network presents A Shower of Stars by Caerdwyn. Read for you by DustyKatt. With Meredith Sims, Allie Loopster, Rev, Hannah May, Jen McGregor, and Tay. Music by Caerdwyn. Produced by RobBob. And edited by One Trick. Chapter 5. The Finest Hour. Though my soul may be set in darkness, it will rise in perfect light. I have loved the stars too fondly to be fearful of the night. Sarah Williams. The falling star was huge, easily as large as a house. It looked like an irregularly cut diamond, nearly transparent and covered with facets. Any light which entered into it was refracted within, emerging in bursts which were uncomfortably bright. It was attended by several of the lesser red shards, which circled the main shard in quick, close orbits. Though none of the Pegasus ponies watching it were unicorns, even they could sense enormous magical energies bound up within it. As soon as all the flyers were gathered, the Wonderbolts leader called out,
"Passes in groups of 2! Kick to the left! Keep at it! Watch for those red escorts and mind the vortex behind! Go!"
The Wonderbolts and their guest formed up as ordered. The first pair, Soren and Spitfire, banked and dived. As they picked up speed, they curved outward from the path of the falling star to avoid the superheated air behind it, then back in to intercept. Even as they did so, the next pair, Misty and Blizzard, began their dive, with Captain and Tycho next. Nimbus and Rainbow Dash queued up behind them. Soren, in the lead, rolled as he came alongside the falling star, then made a mighty buck that would have equaled the best effort of any Earth pony. There was a dazzling flash, and a sound like a slab of steel dropping to a concrete floor. Then Soren was tumbling out of control, trailing smoke. Spitfire immediately aborted her pass and dove after Soren, catching him on her back. The next pair had already committed themselves to the pass. Again, there was a flash on impact, and 2 ponies were cartwheeling through the sky, unconscious, with smoldering wingtips. Captain yelled,
"Abort!"
as he and his wingman dove to save the injured ponies, before they could hit the ground. Rainbow Dash's heart was pounding. She had never felt such fear, not even when facing down Nightmare Moon. Nimbus descended towards Captain, calling,
"They may need backup."
Rainbow Dash followed, grateful for something to focus upon. As they descended, their path took them past the falling star. Rainbow Dash could not help but stare at it as they flew past. 1,000 glittering facets distorted the scene before the huge crystal, and for just a moment, Rainbow Dash was looking at her own reflection. There was a stab of pain as she met her own gaze, a headache, and an overwhelming feeling of malice from the direction of the great shard. For an instant, Rainbow Dash recalled the pitiless eyes of Nightmare Moon. Just then, beyond the falling star and behind the mountains in the direction of Manhattan, there was a bright golden flare which illuminated the horizon. The light was caught in the crystal, and beams of every color radiated from its surface. As the light over Manhattan faded, so did the prismatic rays emanating from the falling star, and it continued its inevitable arc towards Ponyville. An inspiration came to Rainbow Dash with a sudden heady rush. She turned to Nimbus.
"I've got an idea, but you're gonna have to get the Wonderbolts away from the falling star! Far away!" "What?"
began Nimbus, who was still a little dazzled from the blinding color burst.
"Trust me,"
Rainbow Dash said, then pulled up sharply and began climbing as fast as her wings would take her, back in the direction of the falling star, then above it. Nimbus shook her head, then turned and folded her wings, diving down to the other Wonderbolts to relay what Rainbow Dash had said. She thought she had an inkling of what Rainbow Dash intended, and it scared her, but there was no time to do anything else. Rainbow Dash climbed as fast as she could, panting,
"Hurry up! Hurry up!"
to herself. Glancing back, she saw that she would have to commit herself now if her plan would have a chance. Arcing up, she turned on a wing over to dive again and aimed straight at the falling star. She accelerated. Stretching her hose before her, she pushed herself to the limit. A multicolored vapor trail formed behind her. More speed, more speed. She needed more speed. Already she could feel the searing heat pouring from the wake of the falling star. Her war boots began to become warm, then hot. In a moment, though, a shockwave cone began to form before her, and the worst of the heat was deflected. Still she accelerated, clenching her teeth as the blast of air distorted her face. The falling star seemed to expand rapidly before her as the shot cone sharpened and began to collapse upon itself. The timing would have to be perfect. The Wonderbolts descended toward a hill on the edge of town, bearing their injured to a group of ponies gathered on the hilltop. Captain had cursed like a sailor at Rainbow Dash's impetuousness, but had no ideas of his own. The Pegasus ponies slowed as they neared the ground, then looked back. They could see Rainbow Dash's color streak as she closed on the falling star.
Is that crazy filly trying to kill herself?
He said. He turned to look for Nimbus, to ask her if she had any idea what was going on. But Nimbus had not followed the others down. Then he saw her. She was flying back up toward the path of the falling star. Nobody could fault a Wonderbolt for sticking to her wing pony, regardless of anything else. Captain shrugged Misty from his back onto the grass into the care of the others, then leapt into the air, surging toward the two reckless Pegasus ponies. Moments later, those of the Wonderbolts who could still fly followed. The ponies of Ponyville looked up at the brilliant star descending upon them. Many of them were exhausted, smudged with soot, or bleeding from small cuts from fragments of shards that had made it to the ground. The area near Twilight was littered with ruby-like crystals, the remnants of those she had managed to deflect or shatter with her telekinetic magic. Beside her stood Rarity, bedraggled and covered with sweat. While Twilight had been deflecting large pieces from the town, Rarity had seen to it that shrapnel from the crushed shards had not harmed Twilight. Much depended upon the purple unicorn, and Rarity would not allow her friend to be hurt. Rarity's hobby of telekinetic archery had paid off handsomely. Aside from leg-trembling exhaustion, they were both uninjured. There was no way that Twilight could stave off the approaching crystal, however, and it was too late to run. In a moment of eerie calm, the remaining ponies gathered around Twilight and Rarity. Whatever came next, they would face together. There was a sudden explosion of light in the sky. Every color of the rainbow suddenly burst from a point next to the falling star, and a thunderous boom knocked every pony to the ground. A disk of brilliant color expanded rapidly, intersecting the falling star crystal. The crystal glowed as brightly as the sun for a moment, then shattered into a million pieces as a shock plane of the sonic rainbow sheared it, overwhelmed it, filled it with more pure light than it could absorb. Secondary detonations followed as the orbiting red lesser star fragments crossed the sheer plane of the sonic rainboom. Over the rumbling echo of the explosion, every pony heard an anguished, hate-filled voice screaming, then fading. From the center of the rainbow burst, a multicolored streak continued in the path of the fragments of the exploding falling star. The ribbon of color was irregular, erratic, and its source was tumbling. The rainbow streak was about to be engulfed in the deadly flak field, but the streak was suddenly sharply displaced from the shrapnel path, then vanished. The ruined shards began to fan out, tumbling, glittering, slowing. It was like a glass window that had just been shattered, only much larger and more violently. Twilight scrambled to her feet, lowered her head, then strained. Her horn began glowing as brightly as a blowtorch, and a moment later, blood started trickling from Twilight's nose. A faint hemispherical flicker stretched across the town plaza. The splinters of crystal began pelting it, raising little purple sparks where they hit the shield, disintegrating into pieces no larger than a grain of sand. The sound of the impacts was like hail on a tin roof. For 10, perhaps 20 seconds, the town square was bombarded by razor-sharp shotgun blast of crystals, but none struck the ground or any pony. Silence followed for long moments, followed by the gentle rushing sound of sand being poured onto a beach. The night sky overhead was clean. A ragged cheer went up from the crowd. As the last of the diamond sand settled, Twilight staggered, then collapsed. A thin glowing wisp of violet smoke rose from her horn, and a small divot showed where a flake had spalled under the strain. Rarity knelt down beside her friend.
Twilight! Twilight, are you okay?
It took a few moments before Twilight was able to lift her head. She was a mess, discolored on her muzzle and chest from the nosebleed.
Ugh, what a headache.
She was helped to her feet, then a scrap of cloth began dabbing away the blood as Rarity tended to Twilight. Twilight shooed Rarity away.
I'm okay. Others need the help more.
At that moment, Captain descended to the town square. Draped across his back was a dazed Rainbow Dash. 2 large bruises discolored the blue along one side of her chest. The bruises looked almost like a pair of heavy, indistinct hoof marks. An ugly, profusely bleeding gash on Rainbow Dash's wing, from which a crystal fragment protruded, drew a gasp from Rarity. Captain gently set Rainbow Dash down. As soon as he was free to do so, he urgently took wing again. A white pony with a red cross on her flank began caring for Rainbow Dash at once, withdrawing the shrapnel shard and pressing gauze against the wound to staunch the bleeding. While the nurse was doing so, Rarity carefully removed Rainbow Dash's steel hoof boots. then called for a bucket of water. When it arrived, she began washing the scorched hooves. Other injured ponies gathered nearby, and volunteers began treating them as well. The casualties were given a respectful distance by the crowd. It was several minutes before Rainbow Dash stirred. She began mumbling.
What? How did I get down?
She looked around, disoriented, for a moment, then groaned as the pain in her ribs and wing began to bring back memories in bits and pieces.
Oh, Nimbus. Why did you... Nimbus?
Her head snapped up as she realized where she was. Everyone was talking to her at once in an excited babble, but she ignored the crowd as she called,
Nimbus? Where are you?
Rainbow Dash began to curse through clenched teeth. Her eyes locked on the Wonderbolts leader, standing alone near the edge of the gathered ponies. Her voice took on an edge of panic. She roughly shouldered the crowd aside, stumbling towards Captain.
You've got to find her!
Captain lowered his head, then brusquely swept the flight goggles to the ground. Rainbow Dash almost shrieked into his face.
Where is she?
Slowly, Captain looked up at Rainbow Dash, then toward the edge of Ponyville next to the library. There stood a small cluster of blue-suited ponies. Even as they watched, from the sky a pair of alicorns slowly descended to the group, flanked by two bedraggled-looking armored Pegasus ponies. The princesses looked down at the ground in the center of the group, then together lowered their heads. A chill of dread ran down Rainbow Dash's spine. Rainbow Dash tried to take flight, but One Wing wouldn't obey her. She began stumbling toward the library, angrily lashing out at ponies who tried to restrain her.
Let go of me! Let me go!
She half galloped, half limped toward the circle of Wonderbolts. Behind her, Twilight and Captain followed. Rainbow Dash suddenly halted. She could see a still pony form on the ground, surrounded by jagged diamond shards, and by the Wonderbolts.
No!
Celestia stepped up to Rainbow Dash, leaned forward to nuzzle her.
I'm so sorry.
Celestia whispered. Rainbow Dash's lower jaw began quivering.
No! It can't! You have to do something! You have to!
She turned wet, pleading eyes up to Celestia. Tears began to run down Celestia's cheeks.
I cannot. I have no power over this. No power.
Her voice took on a low, almost raspy sound of barely restrained grief. For a brief moment, the burden of 1,000 years bore down upon her.
I am helpless in the face of death.
If I could trade places with her.
Luna stood forlornly, a few steps away, her eyes closed as she tried to maintain a semblance of self-control. Twilight gingerly approached her, leaning against her. A moment later, Captain did the same, wordlessly offering consolation and absolution. Rainbow Dash buried her face against Celestia's shoulder, weeping. Luna, Twilight, and Captain moved close, drawn by the need to share grief. The Wonderbolts pressed in around them, touching, trying to draw comfort from each other. Celestia extended her wings and held them all tightly, making no effort to hide her own tears. Above, the stars shone against a clean, flawless night sky. Epilogue. The Element of Loyalty. Greater love hath none than this, that one lays down life for one's friends. Yeshua. Rainbow Dash's wing and ribs still hurt. 2 weeks had passed since the starfall, and she had only been back in the air for a couple of days. She was being very careful as she flew, avoiding any sudden changes in speed or direction, and she took advantage of whatever lift she could find as she traveled. A thermal bubble under a puffy white cloud, the rising portion of waves generated by moving air downward of a ridge of hills, it was all welcome. There certainly would be no rainbow trails today. Nonetheless, she had insisted on pulling Twilight's new chariot. Therapy, she had called the task, using a word looked up just for the purpose of convincing Twilight to let her do it. Fortunately, this magically enhanced chariot was much improved from the first attempt. It was light, stable, and strong. As they passed over Ponyville, they could still see signs of the terrible night. Most of the damaged buildings had been repaired, the shard-gouged pits filled in, and the glittering dust swept up. But work was still ongoing. In the town square, Mr. Cake hobbled along on a crutch. The good news was that the cast on his foreleg would be coming off in a few days, according to Pinkie Pie. In a similar vein, reports from Camelot and Manhattan spoke of only modest damage, and life in the cities was more or less back to normal. It was a miracle that the night had not been more costly. Though there had been many injuries, it could have been so much worse. The loss of life was light. Just one pony. Climbing to the height of Cloudsdale was an effort, and when they finally alighted on the cloud surface, Rainbow Dash was exhausted. Twilight stepped out. Buoyed by her cloud-walking spell, she nosed at her friend's neck, wordlessly sharing concern. Rainbow Dash waved her away, but a smile showed her appreciation.
I'll be back later.
Twilight said.
I'll be at the Equestria Atmospheric Administration Office. They have so much data on the effects of the starfall.
Don't swell your head with too many reports.
Rainbow Dash replied.
You're heavy enough without your brains getting bigger.
Twilight laughed and trotted away, her hooves raising little cloud puffs like dust. Rainbow Dash backed out of the chariot harness, wincing as she folded her wings to do so. For a moment, she became entangled in the tack and let fly a few words that would have made a draft mule blush. Someone stepped up and helped her, lifting the force trap and padding from Rainbow Dash's head where it had gotten stuck.
Aren't you the versatile one? Towing chariots, saving towns? Can you cook too?
There was a laugh, and Rainbow Dash turned to the Pegasus who had helped her. It was Spitfire, out of uniform, and though the urge to fanfilly briefly arose in Rainbow Dash's chest, it was suppressed by something more profound. A camaraderie from the shared experience.
Depends. Are you tough enough to survive my cooking? Some can't hack it.
Rainbow Dash grinned, then accepted a wing hug from Spitfire.
Thanks very much for coming, Rainbow. There's something I wanted you to see.
Spitfire looked closely at Rainbow Dash's wing and the nearly healed gash.
I wasn't sure you were ready to travel.
Oh, it's nothing really.
Rainbow Dash replied.
Nurse Redheart said I'll be good as new in a week or two, though she'd be mad if I knew I'd flown here today.
Spitfire laughed.
What she doesn't know won't hurt her. I'm not so sure it'll do you any good, though.
She and Rainbow Dash began walking toward a nearby colonnaded building, the headquarters for the Wonderbolts. Rainbow Dash had been there once before, after the Young Flyer competition. It seemed to Rainbow Dash to be an eternity ago. The lobby was as Rainbow Dash remembered it. Statues of Wonderbolts on the floor and suspended by wires from the ceiling. A single royal guard whose presence now made sense. A small gift shop where Wonderbolt merchandise was sold, of which Rainbow Dash had a nearly complete collection. And a door which would only unlock to the hoof press of one of the team. Spitfire opened the door, and they entered a wide corridor beyond. The hallway led past the ready room, in which several of the Wonderbolts were couch-napping, bragging at each other, playing games, and in general, just loafing about. A couple of them, still in bandages, waved. Spitfire led Rainbow Dash along, and they passed doorways to barracks, locker rooms, a gym, and other more mysterious rooms, which the Victor's tour several months ago had not included. Rainbow Dash wanted to ask about them, but she could tell Spitfire had a destination in mind. They arrived at the far end of the hall, and through another locked double door, more ornate than the others, they entered a private garden in an open-air atrium. The garden was perhaps 50 feet across and circular. Only the doorway and the open roof allowed access. Stone planters held lush ferns and flowering shrubs, and climbing tendrils of morning glories clung to the columns supporting the eaves. In the center of the garden was a circular dais of dark marble, inlaid with light alabaster in the royal 8-rayed sunburst. In the center of the sunburst was the Wonderbolt insignia. The portion of the wall opposite the door was half covered with granite plaques, each with a cutie mark deeply engraved, but nothing else. Some of them were obviously old, as time had somewhat weathered the engravings and discolored the stone. Rainbow Dash looked in puzzlement to Spitfire, but Spitfire merely gestured for Rainbow Dash to look more closely. The last of the plaques was fresh, the stone mirror polished, and the edges of the inscription sharp-edged. The glyph was a stylized fireworks rocket. Rainbow Dash took a sharp breath, and then turned to face Spitfire. She saw that Spitfire's eyes were as wet as her own were becoming.
That's Nimbus. Her mark.
Spitfire nodded.
This is the Hall of the Fallen. These are the marks of the Wonderbolts who have died so that others could live.
Rainbow Dash took a step backwards to take in the wall. There had to be at least 20 of the plaques.
So many.
Once again, tears began flowing. A moment later, Rainbow Dash felt a comforting wing draped across her back.
And she won't be the last. This is what it really means to be a Wonderbolt.
Spitfire said quietly.
This is the real reason we exist. We wanted you to see this. Most ponies wouldn't understand, but I think you do.
Rainbow Dash turned to face Spitfire, and saw that behind her, several of the Wonderbolts had gathered in the doorway and were silently watching. Not all of their eyes were dry either, and none tried to hide that fact,
So,
said Spitfire.
knowing this, do you still want to be a Wonderbolt someday?
Rainbow Dash stood still for a long, long while. Her head lowered, and she closed her eyes as 2 steady drips of renewed grief fell from her cheeks. She finally looked up, and slowly approached the memorial wall. She reached out with a hoof to touch Nimbus's memorial stone.
More than ever.
Whispered Rainbow Dash.
More than ever.
This has been A Shower of Stars, written by Caerdwyn. Read for you by DustyKatt. Produced by RobBob. Edited by One Trick. Starring Ali Oopster, Hannah May, Jen McGregor, Meredith Sims, Rev, and Tay. Music by Caerdwyn. This performance is copyrighted 2013 by Caerdwyn and the Everfree Network. My Little Pony Friendship is Magic is a trademark of Hasbro Studios.